Check sound, check. Check sound. Check, check, check. Check sound. Check.
Start out, I'll talk primarily on feminism and then there's talk by our study and graduate Tinder on guidelines. There's an update from the hackathon. There's an update from reviewers and a status of reviews. There's research group drafts, updates, discussions. Then there's an introduction to our new tech advisors, Melinda and DKG, and then any other business. Now, let me go through the, is it that one? To the right. The note well is there. So just quickly, we were chartered. We have those objectives. I assume most of you have seen them. But perhaps it's good to read them because there have been questions about our objectives. So perhaps it's good to once again repeat them. To expose the relation between protocols and human rights with a focus on the rights to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, though we're not limiting to just those freedoms. To propose guidelines to protect the internet as a human rights enabling environment in future protocol development in a manner similar to the work done for privacy considerations in RFC 6973. And to increase the awareness in both the human rights community and the technical community on the importance of the technical workings of the internet and its impact on human rights. Our outputs are drafts concerning progress of the project, methodology, policy and academic papers, film and textual interviews, data analysis and visualization, protocol analysis. The work to date, starting in October 2014, the research group proposal, the screening of the film, Net of Rights, December 2015, we were actually chartered. 17, RFC 8280 came out. The current work includes those drafts, freedom of association on the internet, guidelines for human rights protocols, and notes on networking standards and politics. Okay, now before going on and before passing it on, I mean, one of the things that's not listed here is as part of this status, over the last couple months, there have been some discussions, some issues, a little bit of consternation perhaps with some of the considerations that were written and delivered. over the last couple months, there's sort of been a review of the co-chairs and the group. And basically, to put it briefly, we were allowed to continue as co-chairs, but we were given assistance in doing the work, and that is the technical advisors that have been given, that have basically been recruited to help with the group, basically to make sure that we are sort of adhering to all of the IETF considerations that there might be in terms of doing our work, because we've gotten a little close at times, perhaps, to things that appeared to other people to be engineering. So having said that, don't want to go into depth on it, but basically, as part of transparency of what has been going on. And then at the end, I'm basically going to open it up and do it as a practice whenever to the technical advisors to sort of give us a few words on what they saw, what they experienced, where we're at, see how that goes. I told them I would do it at the end, so I won't ask them to do it at the beginning. Otherwise, I might have, but I didn't think of that before. So at this point, I guess we can go to the first presentation, which is Mallory. Thank you.
Hi, Mallory Nodal from Article 19. Originally, this was going to be delivered by the Association for Progressive Communications, which worked on this document that I'm going to talk about. It's called the Feminist Principles of the Internet. But I worked for APC before this. Yes.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I forgot. We don't have a note taker.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, we have a note taker. Thank you, Corinne. And we don't have a scribe. Jabber scribe. Oh, Corinne is Jabber scribe. Then we don't have a note taker. Which were you volunteering to be? Were you volunteering to be both?
It's not both. No, you can't do both.
Yeah. So
I can be note taker.
okay, thank you. So thank you, and
Yeah.
forgive me for
Not at all. Thank you
having
for remembering
interrupted the
that.
start.
It's quite important. Yeah. So again, we weren't able to bring someone from APC here to talk about this because their entire women's rights program is meeting right now. We tried to fill it in, but I was also part of this process because I used to work for APC when this was going on. So I can talk about it. But just to note that this is not, so there is a draft related to this, but I'm going to start with this as a presentation of basically to give this group an idea of the movement around feminist organizing on the internet. So it's for your information. It hopefully will be interesting. Right, so the Association for Progressive Communications has a women's rights program, and they're the ones who have pushed this along, although it's been a collective effort with lots and lots of different organizations, small grassroots groups around the world. And that includes organizations that are maybe just women's rights groups that don't have anything to do with technology. It also includes other groups that maybe have more of a focus on technology. And yeah, it's a collective effort, but these are the folks that are behind it. So this is just a very broad overview of what we mean by a feminist internet. So it says it right there. The purpose is to work towards empowering more women and queer persons to fully enjoy their rights, engage in pleasure and play, and dismantle patriarchy with the use of the internet, collaborating online. So this is a pretty well-known person in feminist theory saying there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So there might be this question around like, why are feminists talking about the internet and internet rights? It's very much ingrained in everything that a women's rights organization would want to do. People fighting for women's rights online. The internet is part of that now. And also to note that this is there's a lot of question around, okay, what is feminism? And there's many different interpretations of that. This is definitely a perspective of intersectional feminism, which would include lots of questions around race, gender, sexuality, class, etc. And you'll see that as we go through what the principles actually are all about. So the purpose of coming up with principles for what a feminist internet would look like is to provide a framework, which is why I think this is particularly interesting to this group. We work in frameworks, we work in standards. It's easier to understand if you can kind of break out the issues. So this framework intends for women's movements to be able to articulate and explore because it's a process, issues related to technology. So the principles, I'm going to go into detail here. The visual is not, well, it's very exciting and cool, as you can see, but it doesn't tell you much on this slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what each principle includes and entails. And they're broken into, I think, 5 different sections. So the first 3 principles under the access section are thus. So when it comes to access to the internet, the things to note about the way this is expressed, and by the way, you can actually find all of this at this URL. So if you wanted to go there now, you could read along. I'm not going to read them verbatim. But the thing about internet access as it relates to feminism online is that it needs to be universal, acceptable, affordable, unconditional, open, meaningful, and equal. Access to information is the second one. That things to note there, it's really in 2 parts. So one is that sexual and reproductive health and rights, pleasure, safe abortion, access to justice, and LGBTQ issues are available. Information about that is available online. And in the second part of that, which is related, it's available in language, abilities, interests, and context, and a diversity of those, because feminism is an incredibly diverse framework. The last piece around reclaiming technology, that also kind of has 2 parts. So it's around the right to code, design, adapt, and critically and sustainably use internet technology. And reclaim it as a platform for the purpose of, the second part, to challenge the cultures of sexism and discrimination. So the second section of principles is around movement building. So this is a really important part of any kind of social movement, is that you need the ability to organize together as a collective voice. So those items, the first one is around resistance. So this also, I think, is important to note in the context of the online world and the offline world. So the offline world is experiencing globally a shrinking of civic space, like a shrinking of places where we can go and convene. We see this to varying degrees in different parts of the world, but noting that the internet is important in that way because it allows for, ideally, more of that collaboration. And there's a movement of organizing that traditionally happened offline that now happens a lot online, and they're related. So there's also an intersection of this principle about resistance necessarily with the access to the internet. So to be able to utilize the ability to organize online, you need to first have access. So there's some, you'll see throughout the principles are all somewhat interrelated, and that's pretty much by design. So that's what I would say about resistance. And then on movement building, which is not the second one, they might have changed this around, sorry. Mine says the second piece under movements is movement building. So that is about facilitating new forms of citizenship. A global internet leads to such a thing. And then connecting across territories, demanding accountability and transparency across borders. And then the last one is around internet governance. So internet governance is there, is in the principles because there's a necessity to challenge the patriarchal spaces and processes that control internet governance, to put more feminists and queers at the decision-making table, to democratize the decision-making, and to diffuse ownership, and to upset power in global and local networks. So there are a couple around economy, because that's quite important, because part of patriarchy means that there are some people that are, economics comes into play very strongly there. So the first piece is around alternative economies. So this is to interrogate the capitalist logic that drives technology towards further privatization, profit, and corporate control. And to address that, a feminist internet would necessarily rely on cooperation, solidarity, commons, environmental sustainability, and openness. And then the last piece around this is open source. So they're committed, the feminist principles of the internet are committed to free and open source software so that there can be creation and experimentation with technology. And then this is the second to final piece on expression. So there's a few different pieces here. So one is obviously the internet is can have an amplifying effect. So the point here is to try to amplify resistance to the state, the religious right, and other extremist forces who otherwise, and still do to some degree, monopolize discourses on morality, while at the same time silencing feminism. The second piece is on freedom of expression. This is interpreted, I wouldn't say strongly, the way it is in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It has a much broader view. And this principle focuses on sexual expression as a freedom of expression issue, and also pushes back against the opposite of this, which is to control, surveil, regulate, and restrict feminism and queer expression with the use of technology, legislation, and violence. The last piece on expression is around sexuality. So sexuality is seen as a form of expression, and so therefore the use of pornography online is mentioned here because it has to do with the agency, consent, power, and labor issues of pornography. So it's interesting that this principle actually tries to take the conversation out of a discussion about the internet and about content and tries to turn it around and look at the real issues that are inherent in something like pornography. So it's a much bigger issue, it's a societal issue, and the principle points to solving it from that perspective. So lastly, on embodiment, and otherwise known as agency, there's, again, I'm looking at different language here because these evolved. I should have talked a little bit more about that. I can do that at the end. So agency or embodiment has several different parts. This is the biggest section, and I think something that when people think about what feminists would have to say about the internet, this would be a lot of what would come to mind. So consent, really big issue, something that feminists think a lot about. The idea of using consent in the context of the internet would be to build an ethics and politics of consent into the culture design policies in terms of service of internet platforms. This is also very closely related to the next principle on privacy and data. So the right to privacy and full control, again, consent over personal data is key here. And this principle also talks about surveillance being the historical tool of patriarchy as it's used to control and restrict women's bodies, speech, and activism. And yeah, I would just say that the principle also calls into question not just the private sector and the state, but also individuals and the way that they use surveillance. So noting there, I think what it's indicating is things like spouseware, right? Like you can use the internet, you can use apps to like track the people in your lives. So it's not just about large sorts of powerful entities. The next one's on memory. So memory about what information is online and so on also has to do with consent. So memory is the right to exercise and retain control over our personal history and memory on the internet. You can imagine the discussions around right to be forgotten probably came up in discussing this principle. Knowing who has access to it and under what conditions, and the ability to delete it forever. The next piece is anonymity. So it's expressed here as the right to be anonymous and reject all claims to restrict anonymity online, because anonymity enables freedom of expression and it helps to break taboos of sexuality and heteronormativity. It allows and facilitates for experimenting with gender identity and enabling safety. The next piece is on children and youth, which is, I think it's an attempt to have some say in the narrative around that. So often we find well, at least I see in internet governance spaces, maybe not so much the IETF, the children are brought up. And so this attempts to speak to that, since it's definitely a feminist issue. So the point that they've made on principles around children and youth is that the inclusion of voices and experiences of young people and the decisions made about safety and security online is critical for all the reasons essentially listed in the rest of the principles. And then the very last piece, and this is something that APC has really led on since 2006, is talking about violence against women online. So the last piece is around online violence. So this is key because we need to address the issue of online harassment and technology-related violence, because even though this happens on the internet, It's actually very, very real, harmful, and alarming what can happen online with regards to violence against women. So I will actually back up, which is something I should have done in the beginning, to talk about the provenance of these principles a little bit more in depth. So maybe now it's 2019. So yeah, like 4 or 5 years ago, APC began having these conversations, and they did them in several ways. There were a series of 3 in-person meetings that happened in the Global South, twice in Malaysia, and I'm forgetting where the second one happened. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But so over the course of 4 or 5 years, they convened dozens of activists to talk about this. Again, folks that are coming, women and gender nonconforming people that are coming from just traditionally women's rights organizations, and then also those that have a bit more awareness and understanding of technology. And so that conversation led to several versions of this document. So they started out with a version 1 after the very first meeting in Malaysia in 2015. And then also what coincided with the second meeting was really interesting. They had chatter about it on the internet. So they did, it's like a hashtag campaign kind of. So it was, you can still look it up online, hashtag imagine a feminist internet. And so they were asking people that were in this second meeting, but also online, what, if you could imagine what, you know, if the internet were designed by feminists, like what would be some features of that? You got a wide range of stuff, but it ultimately fed into the second version of these principles. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, it's an incredibly collaborative document. I see it pop up in a lot of different spaces because I think the folks that were involved in the drafting of this feel a lot of ownership over it. And it's spun out several different meetings. If you go to this, if you go to the website, which now isn't visible, it's at the bottom here. If you go to this website, you can see not just the principles, but you can see loads of information about events, case studies. So they've also started doing a bit of research based on this, using examples to kind of help make them more real. And it's just a body of work that continues to grow. And it's definitely a movement of women out there that are aware of this and that use it in their work. And that is why it was meant to be presented to HRPC. It's great that I, in the end, I guess, could do it because we've also, Juliana and I have tried to use this framework as the basis for a draft that explores all of the things that we just said in terms of principles, but then how they specifically would relate to protocols. And that also is very much a work in progress in the sense that we want to model and replicate after this model of doing more consultation. So we're interested in your feedback here, of course, but then also we'll be talking to other groups in other settings who also might be able to feedback into this. And the point is really to kind of what it says in our charter, right? So we want to bring in information about human rights and social considerations into the IETF and into the technical community more largely, but then also to be able to have that have conversations about technology outside the IETF and bring the discussions that happen here to other groups and movements and organizing efforts so that it's clear what is at stake and to have more of a conversation. And so that's kind of the point of that draft and the process around it. That's it. I have these slides, so I'll just go ahead and finish them off because I think it's kind of interesting. So there's some other things you can do online if you're interested in this or want to read more about what people are thinking. This website, genderit.org, is very active. There are posts all the time from people around the world talking about issues in the technology and internet rights space and their impact specifically on gender. It's a really great resource. It's something you should follow. Like if you follow things or have feeds, just add it to your feed. This is another project that APC did that is a bit related, but specifically focused on the sexual rights piece. And so this erotics was also a longstanding project, mostly focused in the Global South and Southeast Asia and Latin America. And you can go here to learn about some of the research they did and the findings they did. But I think this project has sunsetted for the moment, but it's always an active conversation. And then at some point, so Global Information Society Watch is an annual publication by APC and its partners that puts out just thought leadership, I guess, or like research from different country perspectives. There usually are about, 50 to 60 reports individually on a specific topic. And then in 2016, I believe the whole book was about feminism, women's rights, and sexual rights. So you can go on gizwatch.org and look up that publication if you'd like. Again, it gives really specific country-specific context to some of these issues. And then again, because feminists organized, feminist gonna feminist, they do an annual campaign. This coincides with the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence that is, I think, put on by the UN mostly. It happens in November, December every year. And then this APC's contribution and their partners' contribution to this is to have specifically actions around internet and technology. So that's the end of the slides. I think I'm going to now pass it over to Juliana to talk about the draft that relates to this. How are we on time?
We got a few minutes.
Okay. You want to come on it?
I'm sure we'll be
The next. No.
Sorry. Well, if I didn't do this right, then you might just talk about slides.
Bueno, I'm Liana. I am most related with this, feminist. Yeah, I'm most related with that. I am a user and feminist, and I've begun to write it with Mallory, and I will wait a little if it's. It is in a very first version. If you read it. No, it's okay. No, it's okay. Well, and I am very nervous, so that's a good point. But okay. Oof. Okay. What we're trying to do is to talk about. Oh, wait! I will take my computer because I have the slides, so it's easier.
She just Sorry about that. We'll be back on in a second while we find the slides or one, Well, one thing I can do, ask if anybody needs these while we're getting things set. If I can get by without bouncing on something. Sure. Thank you. Thank you. I think I should throw my red nose in my red shoes.
Hi, Melinda Shore. While you guys are finding the slides and getting ready, maybe this is a good time to do the introduction to the tech advisors.
Thank you.
Yeah, because DKG and I, if you don't know, this is DKG, I'm Melinda Shore. We've been asked to step in as technical advisors to the group to address a couple of the issues which have come up. Mainly, we want to make sure that this research group is working well in the context of the IRSG and the IETF, and making sure that relations are good, that people are talking to each other, that the work coming out of this group is relevant to the IRSG and the IRTF, and IETF. So a lot of this is going to be related to the question of how reviews are handled and done. It's been highly contentious. My own view is that they're extremely valuable, that they absolutely need to continue. The focus initially really needs to be on using them as a mechanism to evaluate 8280 and make sure that all the right points are being hit. Also, I think that one of the things that can be done is to work more closely with the working groups whose drafts you're evaluating, and to use kind of standard IETF working processes. But just to make sure this goes more smoothly, that the value to this research group is primary, and yeah, by a little bit of context, I'm from Alaska. I'm very concerned about rights in the circumpolar north. We don't get to hear that much about that in this environment. So I'm carrying the flag for that as well. So thank you.
Shall I go now? Yeah. So hi, I'm DKG. I'm Daniel Kahn Gilmore. I work for the ACLU. I'm here at the IETF because I care about a number of human rights and their interactions with protocols here. And I think the research that's happening in this research group is important and informative. And to the extent that we can see that research have more of a clear theoretical backing. And sorry, anywhere I turn, my back is to somebody. And I have. I've been contributing here at the IETF with this sort of thing in mind for quite a while now. I know other people who are here have as well. And I want to offer myself as a resource to folks who are interested in these issues. And if there's ways that I can help with applying this analysis or with helping people think about this as they participate more actively in the IETF and the IRTF, I'm open to that. So anyway, I don't want to take away from the presentations that we have here, but just want to flag myself as hopefully a resource for people in this research group.
Thank you. I want to thank both of you for that. I want to thank both of you for stepping in while we caught up on everything. I want to sort of explain just slightly that until yesterday morning, this was going to be our goodbye meeting and welcoming of new chairs. And it's only through the day yesterday that we discovered that we were actually going to stay on as co-chairs. So use that as an excuse for the lack of together. Please go ahead.
Okay, I must say that as a user, DKG has been really important in trying to understand how does IETF work, because 6 months ago I didn't know that IETF exists. So I'm really interested in trying this information and these experiences, most of all, here. But for me, it's really difficult to be inside so many engineers. So, well, what we want to do in the draft is to think about how technical decisions on infrastructure standards and protocols, what you do, impact on internet users around the world, but specifically on marginalized groups and communities. But this is not only, for example, what Gaia do, which is like people in places far away from the centralized cities and so on, but socially condemned, vetoed, or excluded because of their difference. So the way they express themselves, which in terms of language or color of skin or bodies or practices or forms or any. So starting with this work, we have the reference like the 8280, which I think you know, and the 7704, which talk about how does IETF works inside the dynamics you have inside the IETF. And I recently read the Internet is for users, for end users, which for me it's very important because I am an end user. So this is like a call to think about not only the operators, but how does this work can be impacting on on the final chain, I think. Well, as Mallory was presenting, the expression is a chapter in Feminist Principles of the Internet. So we want to take the expression as a framework in this work, as a framework in the sense that feminist movements have used for years the Internet to meet, to resist, to, I don't know, amplify their voices, and using the formats Internet offer, you know. But on the other hand, inside the IETF, there are many ways in which you are, or you have been for long years, expressing about gender, bodies, and people in general. As we're talking about machines, gender is really present in documents. One of the ideas is to look back the archive, not only RFCs, but drafts, and see how gender is being expressed there. So in the short document we have for now, it's mentioned that this is something we do, but we are not doing it yet. But this is the plan, like searching for words like woman, women, man, man, he, she, it, blah, blah, blah. And the other issue is to search for the term safety, because you talk a lot about security and safety too. And it is interesting because I work in digital security, and in digital security with gender perspective, which is much more related to violence cases, which, as Mallory was saying, occurs in the user level. You know, you don't need to be a government or a big institution or have a lot of resources, but what happens on the user level permits and enables a lot of violence against women and many other groups, marginalized and vulnerable. So that's the other thing. Okay, so the feminist principles, what we're gonna do is try to take some users' cases, and well, this is very first. So what we plan to do next is to better explain some terminology, feminist terminology, trying to explain it to you. So we need a lot of comments about that. Develop some other concepts, and what I was telling you, review the archive and take the use cases. And this is a collaborative process, so this is not the only place where it will be developed, because in this moment there is a lot of feminist technical community. I don't know, like administrating infrastructure and so on. So we want to construct the, I don't know, like collect the cases and experiences and try to construct in dialogue with you and with that community there. And well, our next meeting is in the Internet Freedom Festival next week. And yeah, that's all.
Thanks. Could take a question or two if there is one before moving on.
Oh, go ahead. So this is a question from Niels, and it's actually not directed at Juliana, but I guess at the either IETF chair, outgoing, incoming. So he was wondering who initiated the RG chair review, IAB, RSG. Oh, there's a response already? Never mind then.
Thank you, Phil.
Okay, so that has been answered in the chat. Okay, in which case, if there's no question on Juliana's talk, Farzaneh. Oh, you have a question, please.
Hi, Anchal Malhotra from Boston University. I was just sifting through the draft right now. I haven't read it through in detail, but I had a small question. At some places, the word internet is small I, and at others, it's capital I. Is it intentional? Because I think it changes the context a little bit.
I think
Or a typo.
Right.
So it's all capital I, you mean?
I know some of us have patterns where we use both, but
Yeah, I think it's not decided. It's not.
Right.
It has to be discussed.
yeah, now there are definitely groups that have decided they want to use a lower I. I know that I personally use a capital I when I'm referring to the proper name of the internet and a lower name when I'm talking about internet architecture or something like that. Please.
Hi, Ted Lemon. So I'm just looking at the document and I kind of have a question about what the goal is. I've been reading over various sections of it, and there's a lot of statements in here that make a lot of sense to me and that I agree with. But also, I'm looking at, for example, in section, I don't know if I guess it's 1.5.2, talks about a lot of gendered subjects in IETF RFCs in the draft archive. And I don't doubt that that's true. I also suspect that if you were to analyze that over time, there would be a trend towards a lot less of it. Certainly when I write drafts, I try to avoid gendered language. And so I'm using that as an example. I'm not particularly picking this nit, but I'm wondering if there's going to be an intention to actually associate some data with these assertions as opposed to just making the assertions, or if this is more intended as a sort of a collection of statements of sort of position statements.
I don't know, Juliana, it would be interesting to see data associated with them.
I think it's the only question people have done about the text, and I think there are a lot of assumptions, and I think this work is important because of not taking just assumptions, but facts. So that's why I think it's interesting, and DKG has helped has helped me to have a tool to review the archive. So I am trying to count the terms and the contexts, and it's really interesting. I didn't write it, but it's interesting. So I hope in the next version we have data.
Yep, no, yeah, because showing a trend over time would actually be a very interesting curve to see. And now we're even going to be able to see curves in drafts, I understand, which will be really marvelous. Okay, thanks for waiting. And Farzaneh, please. And then there's also Bradley, which we'll have to bring in with the red button.
Hi, everyone. My name is Farzaneh Badi at Georgia Institute of Technology and Internet Governance Project. I'm presenting this research with my colleague Bradley Fiedler from Stevens Institute of Technology. So if you remember, a couple of years ago, we presented a paper with Professor Muller here at this group about Requiem for a Dream on advancing rights through internet architecture, and we criticized the work of this research group specifically, but more of a here as a presentation on a more constructive side of things, that we need to understand where we are going with the evaluating the impact of internet protocols on rights. And we are being constructive, and we will be kind of proposing a method for how to evaluate and a way forward. We also want to emphasize the importance of sticking with the charter of this group because it is the charter is practicable. We do have our criticism, but it is practicable. The principles are agreeable on to IETF actors, and if we stick with the charter, we might also avoid a politicization of the group work. So, Bradley, do you want to say a couple of words?
Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, I can hear myself really clearly too, which is not ideal. But okay, it's better now. Hi, everyone. I'm going to try not to deafen everyone. I'm Bradley Fiedler. It's great to be here. This is my first IETF. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'm an assistant professor. I'm a historian of computing, in fact, at the Stevens Institute of Technology. And what we're doing here is we're going to start by going over in brief the kind of intellectual history of this idea that you can embed certain kinds of human values in technologies. Then we're going to look at some of the empirical and analytical challenges that are associated with that kind of activity, go through several case studies, and then go to that first step of how we would see a productive research program in this area unfolding. We have on this slide the aspirational name of our internet draft, which we're just putting into internet draft form as we speak, and that'll be available very soon. So the first place to kind of to start is this notion of human rights and protocols. And we want to make clear that this is a special case of this more general question of if human values as a whole, political values, can be put into technologies. So technologies being protocols and human rights being forms of political values. And we just want to note that this idea actually goes back a very long time. We can see cases of it at the very birth of modern scientific and social scientific thought. People like Boyle, maybe the first scientist, people like Adam Smith, Max Weber, and then it was kind of reborn with Lewis Mumford, who's up on the board here. And the common thread from the kind of the origin until the present day of social scientific inquiry into these topics is that technology can impact social orders, societies. It can also restructure them and encourage certain forms of society and inhibit others. But typically, the way that this has always been seen is that the societies that these systems are interacting with are complex, multivariate environments, right? And it's also been understood historically, when people have been doing this for the last few hundred years in ways we'd recognize, that the technologies that are changing society are doing so in a context-dependent manner. So one technology might have a different effect in one place rather than another. And that the way it can be understood is not ahead of time, but rather after that technology has been observed interacting with society for a period of time. So you can get these, trend lines and whatnot. And you can see that kind of work right up until the present day on studies of technical systems and their social impact of such things as, the internet. Now, this is a kind of consensus, I think, in large pieces of the social sciences. It's also, I think, looking through the history of the IETF and the internet governance community, how engineers have often and typically, I think, understood the relationship between the clearly political protocols that they develop and then the effects those things have. Now, in the 1990s, as evidenced in that paper, there was this kind of reinvention of a narrow subset of this broader tradition by people like Lawrence Lessig. But it lacked the context, the attention to the context dependency, and it lacked kind of the recognition that you really have to watch these interact with society, these technologies interact with society over a long time before you can really know what's going to happen. It was also separated from the political projects that tried to use those kinds of observation as a form of social control, like state communism, for example. So it was born anew, but separated from this kind of centuries history of this kind of investigation. And we think that there are actually problems that showed up and things that were learned in asking these kinds of questions over time that can productively be applied to these issues now. So over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to just briefly mention the human rights protocol considerations in the IETF, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Avery and others who have been involved with this since 2015. So the research group came up with a couple of internet drafts, various versions that became at some point, one of them became an RFC. And the principles as charter addresses is to identify and protect the rights enabling characteristics of the internet. So, which is a great goal. However, we need to have better methods to actually achieve this goal and identify the rights. The other, but however, we also see an evolution in the approach of the group to that goes from encoding, arguing that we should encode rights into Internet Protocol, and that is in the version 00 of the research draft in 2015, to it comes and becomes more moderate and accepts that it's actually Internet protocols might enable human rights protection of and protect human rights on the internet. So this was like a background that I thought it's important to know and kind of like remind ourselves why we are here and why we have such group. So we can go to, but then, so the methods that the group argues, and they're coming up with methods at the moment, more kind of like gets this idea that despite the fact that we don't really explicitly say we want to encode in, rights into and values into Internet protocols, we again use that impetus that was used in the beginning when the group was formed to kind of measure the impact and advise the developers to consider values before when they are developing the Internet protocol. So I thought that it would be important, we thought that it would be important in our document to talk about how struggling is measuring political impacts and how sometimes it is impossible. And this is a picture of a North Korean network, internet network that they use their right-enabling Internet protocol and used it as a surveillance and mechanisms that do not necessarily enable rights on the, for their citizens. So, but that is the problem. Measuring the impact of our political decisions before the Internet protocols are in place and used is very difficult. So we might have really good intentions to enable certain rights, and then later on, those protocols might be used actually to do exactly the opposite. So it is not very accurate to and before the protocols are in place to understand and actually come up with values in the design of the Internet protocols. Of course, afterwards, as we are going to explain in the method, afterwards you can consider that with other factors. But before that, it is not possible. So, and Bradley, go ahead with measuring the political chart.
Oh, sure. So, again, it is that kind of issue of whether or not we can, how much that we can start considering political values as part of the design process. So we want to trace back from impact through design and design decisions. And kind of the next step along that causal chain, we have design, the political character of the design, the way that we say a technology is particular, like has a particular form of politics behind it. And speaking of the slides, it's fun that the last slide had IP addresses for the rights constricting North Korean internet, and this is one of the first places the IP specification was published with a DoD, United States Department of Defense seal on it. So how things change. So when we understand how a protocol has impacted human rights or politics in general in the world, we then kind of can go backwards and say, well, if this technology did this particular thing, we will say that this technology has a certain kind of politics that we associate with it. But we should be really clear about what we mean in our thinking here, because there is no real observable or measurable property that's like inherent, that's like matter or something like that, that we can see or measure in the technology itself. And we really have two choices for the way I think that we can talk about this. One is kind of a speculative philosophical metaphysics, where you can say that a technology is, by looking at it, one particular way. So I can say a particular protocol is democratic, a pen is socialist, whatever, right? And it allows us to kind of choose metaphorically, make powerful statements, but then we run into these questions of like, well, is Internet protocol this liberal democratic thing? Is it the US Department of Defense? Is it a bastion of neo-authoritarianism? It's kind of tough to say, it's hard to falsify. The other way to do this is to make measurements of observed causal relationships, right? So you could say clearly that in a certain context, a certain protocol would have a certain kind of consequence. And that's something that is measurable and observable, but it doesn't actually have us assigning a kind of fetishized quality to the protocol itself. Now, once you have a kind of understanding of what a design character is, like what the political character of a design is, either way that you do it, you get back to the design decisions, right? This kind of locus, this important moment that to which attention is being drawn by a lot of this research here. And there's also a couple different ways to identify or to understand those. One is as properties that are inherent in the kind of event, the act of design, right? So I can say my decision right now to implement this particular crypto primitive is liberal, but that person over there doing the other crypto primitive is alt-right, or something like that. And that's fine. I think there's a lot of cases, I would argue they're probably edge cases, but there's a lot of powerful cases where there's clearly a kind of political intent that people would agree on that they can see. But it's also true that we haven't even really agreed what liberal means. Since the invention of liberalism, everyone has a different take. And it isn't clear that we understand our own motivations. We all know someone who claims to have a certain kind of politics, and they're very even, articulate about it, but then maybe act a different way. And we've known that we don't really understand our own motivations very clearly since psychology. Now, so there's that one way to do it, which is kind of ascribing those properties. The other way would be consequentially, like after we can see what the consequence was, go back and say, well, these decisions had those certain kinds of like measurable impacts. And if we do that, what's interesting is that the consequence of those decisions will change over time as context change and the impact of a certain protocol will change. So the same design decision will have different meanings over time. And there's also problems that are involved with, for example, when people make these decisions, we don't know that it's entirely their own agency. So for example, Internet Protocol addresses the interface, right? That wasn't necessarily this entirely creative act. It looks a lot like how interface message processors gave a port to a host on the ARPANET, right? So you have these intellectual trajectories that don't necessarily let people step outside and actually make decisions in a vacuum and entirely politically. So we've got three case studies that we'll go through pretty quickly here. These are in the draft that we posted a kind of preprint of it on the listserv, and the actual formal draft will be coming out soon. The first case study we have is Bordered Gateway Protocol. And we're looking actually at its predecessor, Exterior Gateway Protocol, which did a lot of the same things. And the point we'd make here is that the impact of those protocols are difficult to measure because they were different things to different people. If you were in the internet community, like the, at the time, DARPA-led internet community in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Exterior Gateway Protocol, and which becomes BGP in 1989, is extremely important because it allows you to expand the internet kind of trivially beyond the smaller size that was enforced when all the routers were visible in a single kind of routing architecture, right? This creates the ability to have interior gateways. It lets organizations configure things themselves, and if they screw it up, it won't, tank the whole internet. That's great. For critics of the internet architecture at the time, because there were other options on the table back then, EGP and BGP locked everyone into this homogenizing internet protocol architecture that they saw as basically erasing the network layer and leading to the dominance of one particular vision of what networks should be versus others. So it was a highly contested thing, and we'd be hard pressed not to recognize the kind of differential nature of how political values and their impact are actually understood. The second case study is the domain name system. The diagram here was when Maka Petrus was figuring out the tree. He picked truth as one of the higher level domains and realized he bit off a bit more than he could chew and stopped extending it because that would be pretty tough. In any case, with the domain name system, it was developed in the early 1980s. The first name servers were online in about 85. And in our preprint draft, we look at how if you took snapshots of DNS in 85, 95, and 2005, just dates taken arbitrarily at decade intervals, you would see them you'd see DNS being attached to very different values and very different objectives, right? And what's interesting about that is that the objectives that it was attached to, and also its consequences, changing quite radically at those 10-year intervals, would have us mean that if we went back to John Postel, Paul Malcopetris, and Zha Sing Su and tried to assess the politics inherent in their design decisions, we would come to different conclusions about what was actually going on at those different intervals. Even though those decisions were in fact the same ones, they don't change. We just retroactively kind of retcon them, right? So that's a difficulty there. Another issue with DNS is that you can actually just see, today it's actually really interesting that people emphasize the decentralized nature of it. That really wasn't necessarily one of the things that people were focused on in the early years. And in fact, a lot of the criticism of that architecture was that it was entirely centralizing and locked out other naming architectures. So again, it's also that relational issue with rights. And then finally, the last case study, Internet Protocol. One of the things that's interesting about the way that the Internet Protocol is discussed in terms of the social implications of the Internet is that people from humanists such as myself, social scientists, people that comment on the large-scale social implications of networks and the Internet in particular, have identified the Internet Protocol as the thing that's responsible for the distributed architecture of the Internet. That's really interesting because the Internet Protocol, one of the reasons it was specified was for a network called Autoden2, which had less than 10 nodes. It was actually a fairly centralized network with something we'd call more a network than an internet today, though I suppose it was technically an internet. But the point is it was designed for actually something that looks quite centralized by today's standards. And the change in the topology of the internet over time is not a consequence of IP being radically changed, but of routing protocols and algorithms that have altered the way that routing actually works. So while the Internet Protocol enables the routing that we have today, it's not the deciding factor. And the fact that it has been kind of identified often exclusively as the harbinger of the topology that we have and the fact that things are distributed illustrates the fact that it's really easy to have a hard time in figuring out what the specific impact of one protocol is in a world of many, many protocols interacting in complex and often emergent ways. And that's it for the case studies.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. So now get to the last slide, which I'm going to tell you about the method that we are developing. It's not developed yet, but considering the problems, the issues that we may face in understanding the impact and measuring the impact of Internet protocols on rights, we first of all, we need to identify, as the charter says, we need to identify these rights. And we cannot just go and say this is like a set of UDHR rights or some other conventions rights and just take them and then generally consider the impact on these rights without understanding the context. They are very context dependent, and also their impact is very relational. It might be the Internet Protocol, it might be the whole Internet Protocol, it might be a set of Internet Protocol that are interrelated that might have effect on these rights, or it might be the Internet Protocol as well as the market and law and other actors that will hamper the rights that we will identify. So we need to answer two questions first before we start our research. One is context dependency, but what context are we actually measuring this Internet Protocol? So the impact of the Internet Protocol on our rights. And by context, I do not necessarily mean geographical location, but other contexts like social context. And that way we can also identify the rights instead of just having a laundry list of rights and picking from them. And then the other question that is important to answer is whether Internet Protocol is the right unit of analysis, whether this is really, whether Internet Protocol really have consequences or along with other actors and factors has consequences on our rights. And then when we answer these two questions, then we can go ahead and and measure the impact. So we are working on this method. Thank you very much. If there are questions, I'm here. Sure. Sure. I was very reluctant.
Only because it wasn't sure that it was time for applause, but comments, please.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation.
Remember to give your name and introduce
Sorry,
yourself,
yeah.
please.
I forgot my badge. Gurshabad Grover, Center for Internet and Society. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the argument correctly. I completely agree that it's almost impossible to foresee the entire impact of a particular protocol. But are you also saying that it's so difficult to foresee any sort of impact that that an analysis before a protocol is deployed, for example, is not valuable?
I believe that if it's a new function
Yeah.
that is providing a new angle, yes, it is very difficult and almost impossible. Because if you look at, as historically we see, sometimes intentions are something, and you predict a positive effect, and you get another effect. So it is difficult to accurately predict. Of course, you can predict it, but it is difficult to accurately predict. But if it has been operationalized for a good number of years, I think that there might be ways to consider how it affects us. But then that would not be considering when developing it. That would be reviewing the protocol.
Right. Yeah, just to further answer that, thank you for the question. We also think that, we think protocols are political, and we think human rights are important. We do think, though, that if political considerations became an active part of the development process, or was kind of institutionalized in any way at the IETF, we're concerned that the political values that were being assessed in the people making those decisions would be difficult to measure or know, right? Self-reporting in survey research, we've been trying to get that down for a long time. It's difficult. It would also be, because we won't really know what the consequences of that protocol are for a while, whatever it was that we were seeing in the politics of those people, or asking them to kind of self-report or confess, would be something else. It would be some other kind of bias. It would be some other kind of thing, we think. Once in a while, there could be, I think, these edge cases where it's just blindingly obvious that somebody has an ulterior motive, and it's a, maybe a damaging thing. But most of the time, we think this would actually take us down a bad road in terms of the criteria that we would be expecting IETF members to follow.
Okay, may I respond? Yeah. So thank you for also taking the case studies. I think in my personal experience participating in IETF working groups, sometimes the impact of protocols on human rights or otherwise is very, very apparent. If we just go and look back at TLS 1.3, there was a huge debate about whether the protocol will have perfect forward secrecy or not. And this, in fact, is a political process, right? We have different stakeholders wanting different properties out of the protocol that is being designed. And clearly, I'm not saying that all of the people who voice their concerns about whether TLS 1.3 should have perfect forward secrecy or not have the entire picture of what the impact will be on human rights. But just the simple fact that a simple security property will, that impact was entirely obvious at the time. And this, I think, continues when we discuss DNS over HTTPS or versus using vanilla DNS, for example. So, just removing the abstraction and coming down to specific examples, I think at least the working groups I'm participating in it, the link seems very obvious. Yeah.
We actually criticized that TLS thing in our paper, the paper with Professor Muller, and I don't want to take the time, but we can have a discussion after this. We don't think that it is really apparent which decision is right. Also, it has created some kind of competition between standard setting organizations. So IEEE has come up with its own the TLS. I can't remember the Yeah,
No.
that one. So there are like the other consequences, but I will definitely talk to you about this. We have written about it. I know
Cool,
about it.
cool. Yeah.
Okay,
We're
thank
going to
you.
have to cut the queue after DKG. I've got Niels remotely, but then we'll have to move on. So please.
Ted Lemon. So I lived through the various decades that you mentioned, and your reporting of them seems remarkably inaccurate. And so that leads me to question the conclusions that you've drawn. I think it was pretty well known in the time periods that you're referring to that what we were doing was creating a decentralized infrastructure. We had aspirations that very clearly were not realized, but it was not that big a surprise. There were definitely people who understood at the time that this was happening that the problems that we've seen, for example, with Facebook and data collection and so forth, these were all things that were anticipated well in advance of the appearance of the internet and the ubiquity of online purchasing and online commerce and social networking. So based on the reason I say this is because I feel like it's hard to believe that the solutions that you're likely to propose are going to be useful if you haven't actually understood the history of the internet as it was actually experienced by those of us who lived through those years. So I'm not saying this because I want to make you go away and shut up. I'm saying it because I want you to do more research. I think that it would be useful to actually look at some of the literature from the 80s and the 90s about what was anticipated for the internet and see how that compares to what actually happened. I think you might see that there was actually a great deal of wisdom and knowledge about what the future held, even 20 years before Facebook came along, for example. So, just
yeah, thank you. That's it's a reminder that the history, I think, is very contested. I think the controversies that we were speaking to are available online on the archives of things like the name dropper list and other kind of online discussion forums, as well as just things like RFCs and whatnot. I think our main point about the domain name system is it's not a kind of impossible task of peering into the sentiments of all the people who were there at the time. It's more the ways that it was understood more broadly by a larger community, and also the politics that it was associated with, right? So regardless of whether or not people, working in the trenches in this felt one way or the other, there was still its association, for example, with the SRI NEC, then the Internet, ICANN, PTI, etc. So our example with the domain name system is more about the context in which it operated and how that changed over time. And then again, yeah, the debates, I think there were obviously a lot of different opinions of what happened there, but we're mostly thinking of things that we can see online, but we do recognize that there's a lot of subjectivity there. And if we could communicate outside of this channel about some of those more detailed points, that would actually be really useful, and we would really appreciate it. So thank you.
Yes, thank
Thanks.
you.
And I wanted to say, though, that using the list for the HRPC is an excellent place to communicate and keep having discussions. Please.
Okay, I'm Gabriele Insegni from University of Luxembourg. It's my first time, so I hope I said my comment in the right way. So I definitely agree with you that technology has an impact on society. But then I have some doubt on whether stating, as you stated, do you want to bring back and anticipate the impact of a technology while designing the technology is the right way. I see here some pitfalls, kind of induction reasoning, that you cannot anticipate what happens. And also, for me, the probably questionable philosophical viewpoint that technology can be in itself, not in its use, okay, having a moral value. And for me, also can open to certain threats on invalid reasoning because you may forget certain variables, context. So almost a question or a comment would be probably better instead to think how to design technology in such a way that all these analyses can be possible later. Analysis in the sense of research methods, valid analysis. So basically allowing a objective, repeatable, logically sound, measurable, falsifiable analysis of the impact of technology afterward, ex post.
Bradley, do
The
you want to
question, the
respond?
comment was clear. The comment, or
It is very, to me, it's very ambitious. And sorry, we didn't go to like granular details of our criticism of the approach to consider values while developing internet protocols and why they don't work as effectively as when you like come back and review it. Because, well, basically the ex ante factor here, you cannot really predict. We have shown that in our case studies that you cannot predict whether as a result of the design decision, what you want to achieve will happen.
This is my point.
Yeah, well, we're trying to make that point. So basically what we are saying that instead of considering these values before, like during coming up with the internet protocol, we should consider the impact of the protocol after a while and see whether this is the impact of whether this protocol has any impact on our rights, whether it's only this protocol that has an impact or with like a variety of other factors. So we need to be a little bit more scientific before we come up with guidelines for developing protocols and having values in design.
I think we are on the same page in this. Thanks.
Great.
I think so.
Christian Wiedemer. I was listening to your talk, and the idea of looking at unintended consequences is indeed something that engineers should do. I mean, the historical thing is like, for example, there probably would not have been the wars of religion without the printing press. And the great wars of the 20th century would not have happened without the Industrial Revolution. And now, what is the catastrophe that will happen because of the internet, and how can we prevent it?
We don't know.
I think at the risk of getting into areas that the IETF doesn't cover, such as the Industrial Revolution, I think that's an interesting case where before the factories were built, there wasn't a lot of understanding of what the consequences would be. Prior to industrialized warfare, it wasn't really obvious. And now, in retrospect, we can say, wow, the Industrial Revolution changed the face of the world, and so did World War I in a less productive way. But when people were just kind of thinking, what if I made my guns with factories instead? It wasn't necessarily clear. And in fact, some of the predictions were way off. So, some of the predictions, I think the machine gun will bring world peace because war will become too costly or something like that, right? So I think those examples would be cases where we recognize and we celebrate the dramatic impact that the internet can have, and we worry about the downsides, but we also think that analogous historical transformations speak to that problem of knowing what's going to happen before it does.
Well, I mean, if we have to cite the one unintended consequence we see today is generalized surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, be it corporate surveillance or be it government surveillance, but we see that, and the level of surveillance that we have today, that we see emerging, probably will not happen without the technology.
And do we know that how much internet protocols played a role in that, and whether we can actually stop it by changing these protocols? And the other question, and I know that there was a statement after that IETF issued, but it was a statement. I don't know how much we actually did something about it. The other thing is that when we actually made an example of the printing press in our paper where we presented here 2 years ago, and they told us in this very meeting that this is not an accurate analogy. So it is not. I'm not saying it is not accurate, but we kind of like, this is why we did not make those examples, because we thought that the community might not be receptive to it anymore. So, but internet is apparently different, and this is what they argued. But yeah.
Well,
Hello, Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, ACLU. So I wanted to thank you both for bringing this here and for engaging in the discussion. I think it's important that we think about how we do this research, and I completely agree with you about the context being relevant, and individual reviews of a specific internet draft or a specific RFC may not be sufficient, right? To do such a review effectively, you may well need to bring in context, whether that context is other internet protocols or social or economic factors. So I want to thank you for bringing that lens to this. I think in terms of being able to understand the impact, we may well need to situate these reviews in current political or historical political, depending on what we're looking at, context. So I'm wondering, the argument that I hear you advancing, though, seems to be that prospective prediction is so hard as to be impossible. So we should stick with retrospective analysis. And I'm a big fan of the virtues of not biting off more than you can chew. So I can understand where you're coming from with that. But I also wonder, if we do a historical analysis and we see some clear evidence based on contextual analysis and protocols, what are our obligations? How should we use that analysis going forward? Is it something that should inform future evolutions of the protocols in question, even if we can't predict the results? Or do you see that as like too much, too fast? We should just keep reviewing existing things in the past?
Bradley, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I think that what we're trying to raise, I think, is kind of a cautionary approach to institutionalizing, I guess, political review of protocols. I think that, like the case you gave, if a particular protocol has a demonstrated consequence, and then you're working on new versions of it or something like that, that's an obvious case to have that discussion. I think there are, and we've spoken about this, how there are existing mechanisms in the IETF where those kinds of considerations would be up for discussion. Obviously, the people in the IETF know that they're building things that are used in the world. So it's not that we just go completely blind and develop whatever we want, move fast, break things, whatever. It's that we should be careful about how far we institutionalize things and how far we would be willing to argue for a change of the design process. We're not advocating some kind of amoral, like sociopathic protocol development process. So the example you give, I think, is a perfect one of where you would obviously want to say, wow, this had a certain consequence. Let's think about this as we move forward. We're not against that by any means.
Okay, now I have to figure out how to get Niels, who's, huh? Oh, he just joined again. So I'm not quite sure now how I shift over. I've tried that button, the red button. Okay, I see him.
Here he comes.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Oh, and
All
Bradley
right.
gets to still be there. Cool.
Hi all. Thanks so much for the very interesting presentation. I would be very interested to hear from the scholars whether they have the same opinion vis-a-vis security considerations. So should we not think about the security impacts of something, and should we first do it and then see if accidents happen, and if so, address that?
I will take that. Sorry.
And then the second part would be, do you think it could make sense in the design process to state our expected impact on the world and on values, so that we have something to measure against after that? Because else we have at least a baseline measurement against we can see what we were thinking of the impact it has. So that would make analysis after the fact perhaps easier. Would that also be something that could be included in your model? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Neil. So for your first question, security and privacy has a very precise technical meaning at IETF, and they put that in their documents and considerations. So, and we always talk about like security and privacy, like and the balance between them. But when we talk about the technical definition, I leave it to the IETF developers to discuss that and come up with the. I mean, they have already. So we have a specific for the technicality, we have a specific definition. While if we go to like the outside the world, privacy and security, law enforcement wants to save us from the bad actors, and then you have people that want to have their privacy and not be surveyed. So these are like the questions. So I think we need to really distinguish between the two concepts, the concept of security and privacy at the technical level and at the outside. And the other question, sorry, I forgot your other question. What was it? Oh yeah. Oh, okay. I have a really good example for that. So basically, I don't know if I think that would politicize internet protocols, like saying that I want to advance freedom of expression in the world. That would politicize the internet protocol, and I'm not in favor of it. But if the community accepts that, then that's okay. But then the other thing is, well, that's just like, because I think it was Einstein that came up with like a fridge kind of tech, like come up with like a kind of like a cooler for the fridge, and then it was used for something else. And I don't know if I don't know if always the internet protocol developers have any value in mind to state what they want, or it might be just purely technical, and it might have other effects later. So, and Bradley, if you want to respond.
Right. So I think that those are really great questions. And Niels, it's great to finally meet you. I think that we obviously should think about security. And I think one of the issues with the internet, one of the problems is that people weren't thinking about it soon enough. I think that, but I don't think the lack of security kind of designed in early on was a lack of thinking about it or talking about it. I think it was for other kind of institutional reasons. I think that when the question of whether or not we would state what we expect this to do with respect to certain political values, if I was in a community of people, if the entire planet thought exactly the same way I did about politics, and so did the organizations and governments, absolutely. However, for the people in the room, depending on what your politics are, if Huawei or Cisco made a statement through one of their representatives as to what they were hoping to accomplish, would you find it credible? Would you find it insightful? Do you find corporate press releases credible sources of truth? Furthermore, if let's say for the sake of argument, I was to call Article 19 a liberal organization, and the Hudson Institute or the Heritage Foundation said, we care, and let's pretend they were building a protocol at the IETF. Yeah. And they said, we care about exactly the same human rights you do. Or imagine they're like paleo-conservatives or something like that, people from a totally different place on the political spectrum. Would you find those statements compelling? Would you find them useful? For me, I think that I might see something of value there, but I think normally I wouldn't find a lot of useful information. And I think that our concern would be those kinds of statements would become, there'd be so many latent consequences built into the act of stating them that it would become a problem and maybe detract from the work of the IETF, or even kind of call its legitimacy into question.
Thank you. We've really run over time on this one, but if you have a remote comment, is that bring that one in, and then we really do need to cut this one. But hopefully we'll continue this discussion on the list as opposed to waiting until the next time we're in Prague. But no, please, yeah.
I mean, just quickly, Shivan Sahib, just wanted to say that I wish we understood privacy as much as you think we do, but we don't really. But I think the value, from my point of view, is that the value in having a privacy consideration section is that we do think about it. And as we keep doing this more and more, we eventually learn more.
Yeah, it's easier than the outside world. But okay.
Thank you, Farzaneh. Thank you, Bradley. And
thanks everyone
for the discussion. Now, we've got about a half hour left, and we had about 45 minutes worth of packaging to put in. We had basically a report on the hackathon. We had a discussion of any reviews, and then we did have the 3 drafts that are currently moving. Had a suggestion that we move first to the 3 drafts, and then we can come back to the reviews if there are any, and then to the hackathon. The hackathon's been talked about a lot, and all the wonderful stuff that's being done has been talked about. So if that's okay with people, we'll move to the 3 documents that are in progress. And the first one we were going to cover was The guidelines. Okay.
Hello, this is about the guidelines draft. So we did push an update prior to this meeting. Where do I point this? Yes, the objective of the draft is to create guidelines for writing human rights considerations, and RFC 8280 already contains this, but this will sort of be an update as we do more reviews and get more information from the idea. So the writing is also practice-based in the sense we are drawing from HR review experience, and it is oriented. So it is aimed at helping authors draft their human rights considerations for documents. Yes, this is like a quick summary of the changes we've made recently, mainly expanded connectivity and anonymity explanations and guidelines. There are various editorial changes mostly this time. And one thing we noticed in IETF is that lots of drafts and RFCs are having human rights considerations. And sometimes it's not clear what the framework is. But thanks to Corinne for starting this link. Here we're just collecting all the drafts and RFCs that have a human rights consideration section to see just what's going on. And would love feedback on any of those documents in light of the guidelines draft. So how best to feed that work back into the guidelines if those sections are relevant. And what we've seen is that HR reviews are happening not just of protocols in the traditional sense, but problem statement drafts, architecture solution draft, etc., etc. So for now, the title says guidelines for human rights protocol and architecture considerations. But if you have suggestions on what the scope of the guidelines should be, right now, in my opinion, they're written mostly for protocol analysis rather than having a larger scope in mind. So if you have any suggestions about that, we really appreciate feedback. And I mean, if you have a thought on this, please just step up to the mic right now as well. Yeah. Before.
Anyone? Keep going.
Sure. And thank you, Corinne. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Abri, for reviewing the draft. We will address those comments on the mailing list and hopefully publish a new version soon. And we're also hoping to add more explanation. So wherever there is a guideline states a question, we intend to clearly make the connection between human rights and that particular question, linked to various RFCs in that regard. That will expand. And currently the tag doesn't say so, but I think if it's all right with the RG, we'll make this as an update to RFC 8280, since that also contains guidelines, right? Update. Yeah. So RFC 82 has these guidelines and a theoretical framework for arriving at those guidelines. So we'll just update that part. Yes, and I mean, please step to the mic if you have any comments on the draft and suggestions on how to make this useful for IRTF and IETF.
One thing I was thinking of is that this is sort of a living document that you've got here.
Yes.
And that, you know, making it part, I mean, it's sort of a derivative of 8280, but I think that as people gain more experience, as we go through any methodological sort of work on the considerations and it gets updated, it becomes richer, and then we can figure out what we want to do with it.
Yes.
At some point later. Yes, please.
I agree.
Stefan Bartsmeyer, just to remind that this is a very important work and it's related to the previous discussion, because the previous discussion was how it is difficult to foresee the consequences of something. But we cannot just say, oh, it's difficult, we will do nothing. We have to take decisions. You take the example of TLS 1.3, which is a good one. So it's very useful. This document is very useful to help people to make decisions, because just saying that it's complicated won't help.
Yes.
So we have to be more concrete and precise. This is what the current document is doing.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
One takeaway from the last presentation was, which is that we might even analyze protocols in a particular context. Sometimes they have differing results when used in combination with other protocols, etc. So, I mean, that's something we'll keep in mind as well.
Thank you. Any other comments? If not, we can go on to the next.
Would love
draft.
feedback and reviews on the draft. Thank you.
Yes. So yes, please keep reviewing it. 3 of us reviewing it is a start.
Yes.
But there's more of you in the room, so please.
Thank you.
Okay, the next one was the freedom of association. Was Neil's going to speak to that? And he's joined the queue, and what, we have to press the button?
Oh, and Niels might have something to say about guidelines. Sorry.
And Niels is speaking.
Hello, thanks so much for being here. I have a bit of FOMO for not being with you in person, but luckily I'm here remotely together with Gisela. Gisela, are you in as well?
Yeah, hi, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Hi, everyone.
So thanks so much, everyone, for continuing the discussion on this work, which is, I think, now one of the documents we're working on for quite some time. And we have a new version of that. Next slide, please. And what we try to do as a doc is one specific part of the charter, namely expand and deepen the relationships between specific rights and protocols. And in this case, it's specifically the right of freedom of association and assembly. And what we do not try to do is like analyze specific protocols for their human rights impact or produce new guidelines, even though we do foreground the interrelation between these rights and the guidelines. Next slide, please. So we had 2 full reviews of the document and some co-chair concerns. And based on that, we reworked the abstract and added a research design. The research design sparked quite some discussion in the last 2 days on the list about the nature of ethnography and whether ethnography can expose causal relations. And whether causality can be implied based on these cases. We try to address that, but apparently not so well. But I hope we can have a discussion about that, because I actually do think we can. And if we cannot, perhaps other people could suggest stuff on that. A bit more on that later. So we also try to improve the framing of the cases, the case selection and their impacts. We linked the cases to the guidelines in RFC 8280, so to show where the rights that are mentioned in 8280 and the specific considerations link upon the specific cases as suggested last meeting. We added a discussion on establishing the relation between the rights and protocols and architecture to kind of separate the 2 discussion parts and make the structure clearer. And we added examples and concrete considerations. So that is currently where we are. And next slide, please. And it will be great to have your comments and questions. And what I would like to ask to the group, especially the people who have suggested comments, or reviews, whether they would be willing to participate in the authoring, because Gisela and I have been now working on this for quite a while, and the reviews that have come in, we find it hard to address those issues. So it would be really here to hear about concrete ways forward and whether people would be willing to help shape those as well.
Yeah, and I would like to second Niels on that. This has been a great research group and a great learning process, but at this point, it just feels like the emotional and intellectual investment is not worth it, because we're just not advancing anywhere. And just to stress again, as an outsider and a new person, well, not that new because this has been going on for 2 years, but I would very much like to stress that processes are still not that clear. not only within the obscurity and opacity of the IETF, but also in this research group. So I would very much like to put that on the table as I second Niels to step down as a co-author of this draft.
Thank you. I'm actually very sorry to hear about the emotional stress of it all. And I do apologize for only sending in my comments at the very last minute. I would like to see the discussions actually continue on the list. I think, although we have 2 people in line now, we will continue the discussions. At this point, you know, it is quite reasonable for these discussions to evolve and for you to ask some of us that are commenting to perhaps suggest wording and to suggest such as that. You know, if you want to step down as being the 2 editors on this, we'll certainly work through that and such. But please, going to the microphone.
Hey, it's Joe Hall. I also want to apologize for sending feedback so close to the meeting. I couldn't help it. I don't think I could be an author, but I'm happy to offer tons and tons of text for the things that I mentioned in my review and work on other things. I definitely don't want you to feel like this is a Sisyphean task. You're pushing a boulder up a hill and we're just adding weight to the boulder. And one of the things I think our reviews don't capture is, like, and I'll say for myself, speaking for myself, it's a good doc. It's really good. I think it needs some work, and I think we can get there. And I hope that you don't entirely step away from it, and I hope that we can get you re-engaged with it.
Thank you.
Hey both, this is Corinne from the Oxford Internet Institute. This is a conversation we've been having back and forward when it comes to methods. And I do think we should be really careful in terms of stating what ethnography can and cannot do. As an ethnographer, I feel really uncomfortable about talking about ethnography and causality, because that assumes an epistemic kind of approach that isn't taken within anthropology, which is the main domain that this comes from. That doesn't mean it doesn't serve other super valuable purposes, but let's make sure that if we pick a method, we're also really clear about what that means in terms of what we can and cannot say about the world. And in this case, causality is not the right framing. And I'm super happy to think along and like suggest other ways of making use of the data that you guys have gathered.
Yeah, well.
Thanks so much, Corinne. So what we used here was Gering's criterial framework. And in Gering's criterial framework, it is, which does not come from anthropology, but from sociology. But I'm happy to see how we can improve that. So, but this is where I'm a bit at a loss, because we chose a framework that's quite widely used and widely cited. So I'm a bit at a loss here about what we can do and how we can reach at conclusions. And so I'm again really open for suggestions about methodology, text and otherwise, but currently I'm a bit at a loss.
Okay, yeah, I think continuing the methodological discussion on the list would be good, and I'll confess not having the knowledge of the methodology you're using. My knowledge of the ethnographic was that it was inimical to the notion of establishing causality. So that was certainly where my response came from, but I'm certainly more than willing to learn a different framing and see if I can understand it. And Mallory wanted to make a comment.
Well, just to move this into next steps. So it sounds like there's still active discussion on the list. Also, I've got someone lined up from University of York who will review it. This is Stefan Kutcher, who was here last year in Montreal, and probably will also be in Montreal again. So it'll be a good opportunity to get a full review from him as it really relates to his work in a scholarly way. So that will happen. He's committed to doing a review, I think soonest, because it doesn't sound like you're going to do another version right away. So I think it's good to get all the reviews out and then work on another version perhaps for Montreal if you have it in you, but it also sounds like folks will be able to send you text, so that can help get to the next version.
It would be great to see or to gather, since other people now indicated, would other people be interested in also becoming pen holders and authors of this draft, since it's an RG draft? So I heard people say, but it would be great to have a name to that. Is that a lot to ask?
Well, we could certainly talk more about, switching the editors of this, and you folks have been the editors of this for a while. So we could certainly talk about that, further after the meeting. I don't see anybody with their hand up offering to take over the editorship, though I do have Allison at the microphone now.
This is a different comment.
Yeah.
If there's a need, I think it would be a good idea to talk about the frameworks, but I just took a look and I'd have to pay $36 to read the article by Starr. So when we have these kinds of discussions, it'd be very useful to have an appendix or something that fills other people in on what's in those articles.
Yes, thank you. I had not realized that, but thank you.
May I
Thank
add
you.
something as well before we close it off, if possible? Sorry that I'm not streaming video, but my bandwidth is a little low. So yeah, thank you very much for all of this. As I said, this has been a beautiful learning process, and I believe that this is a very important working and research group. But also, I want to say that I participate in other spaces, academic, journalistic, activist, and I also believe that there could be more respect to each other on the list. That's why it's been so emotionally straining for me, a woman of color, who my first language is not English. We want diversity in the IETF because it is a group of power, but it cannot be like the barrier of entry is so high for us women of color from the global South that can we just be nicer to each other? Can we, even on the list? And I know this is completely out of the scope that we're discussing right now, but what I'm weighing out now is the emotional labor that I'm putting into this and then the outcome that I will have. So it's just, rather than focusing on the 1% that we're disagreeing on, can we maybe focus on the 90% that we actually agree on? So
Certainly. Oh, sorry.
That's okay, I would go for it, just leaving it there.
Okay. And in fact, you've hit upon one of the themes that has been a constant item of discussion in the meeting, not just this session, of the niceness and the respect and the cross-cultural understandings of that. And I saw lots of heads nodding of, can we be nicer? And can we talk about the parts we agree on? And indeed, that is something that I think we can all always do better at. I certainly can do better at being nice. Yes, I'd say yes to that. How we do it and how we achieve it remains to be seen, but yes, we can. Sorry that I cut you off if you have more that you wanted to add.
No worries. It's just emotional as well, so it's hard to articulate, but thank you very much for recognizing it. Thank you for everyone in the room for nodding. And let's keep moving forward in this in just a more healthy way.
Okay, thank you. So I guess that we'll continue discussing this on the list. We'll see if there's anybody that wishes to add themselves to working as an editor on this. I will help contribute. I will continue to comment, but I don't think that a co-chair should be an editor. It sort of combines the roles and confuses them, but I will do what I can with comments, and I'll try to comment on the parts that I like. If we can move on, we've got 10 minutes left, and if we can move on to our last draft, which was the IETF HRPC political notes on networking standards in politics. Who was going to speak to that one? Was that also Niels, or is Amelia around?
I will, if I may.
Okay, please.
Hi all, it's me again. The notes on networking standards and politics. Next slide, please. So the objective of this doc is documenting a long-standing discussion in HRPC, documenting the positions in the community on the politics of protocols, documenting the positions in scientific literature on this topic, and providing a platform to further the discussion without having to repeat it. And it was really interesting to hear earlier the two scholars in the earlier presentation also acknowledging the politics of protocol. So it seems that we're moving towards consensus. But what we're not trying to do in this doc is provide an exhaustive analysis of everything that's possible to make everything political, or provide new guidelines or considerations. This is actually a platform for further discussion. Next slide, please. So the changes that we made is on flow, but also added considerations, very similar to what Dr. Badier just said, is considerations about possible external interventions in the standard development process, such as the standardization of what was called ETLS for a while in ETSI, so that the IETF is not just its own bubble, but there's also a larger context. Next slide, please. We received a very extensive review by Michael Rogers that I haven't yet fully addressed. But what is very clear in that document is that I think we're trying to do too much in this draft, and that it reads like a commentary, like a combination between advocacy and research. And I think that this should solely be research, but then not of the explaining or the predicting kind, but of the describing kind, to ensure that we have a common understanding of how we understand that protocols are political or not, and to what extent. So I will, for the next version, if you agree with me and if you think this is a good way forward, so this is a proposal, remove more human rights language from the draft and simply try to document and shave it back to simply outlining the different positions in the literature and in the community, and not suggest a way forward. And then I hope that we are much closer with the document where we want to be. Does that seem like a fruitful way forward for people, or not so much? So I think that not adding stuff, but just removing stuff might be what is needed here, but I'm very curious to hear what you all think.
So yeah, Mallory here. I support that. I also think that I know you've changed the flow. I like the flow better now. I think we can do better jobs, like I like to edit things. So, changing some of the subheadings, perhaps even just getting rid of the vocabulary section. Like there's some stuff that I think is pretty easy to tackle, but I think it would be good in terms of next steps for you to address Michael's response. There's also been some discussion on the list about this, and then maybe the next version before you upload it into Data Tracker, I can commit to helping with some of the subheading stuff that I'm talking about. But it sounds good. It sounds like a good way forward, in my opinion.
Thanks so much.
And we don't have anybody at the microphone on this one at the moment. So thank you for this. Thank you for all the work you're putting in on these, and for continuing to work on the drafts despite the long periods of silence sometimes. I know I'll try harder to respond to new versions of the document quickly and not wait for the last minute. So anything else on the drafts? We have 5 minutes left. I guess covering, I don't know if there are reviews, but cover the subject of reviews. One of the things that came up, reviews were very much a topic of discussion over the last couple of months. And I think one of the things that's happened is that we're supposed to be doing the reviews to try and understand what we are doing better. In other words, to take the considerations of 8280. That's how this group should be looking at them. In terms of other people picking up the work and using it, I think we should advise them to use it with caution, because it's work that's still in development. But and so very much I'm looking at these now as there's really two different periods when these 8280 considerations can be used in a review. By the people working on the protocol within the groups, if they wish to and they find it useful, it's a good thing. If it's used by this group, we really should be using it more as a learning exercise on how do we make the considerations better. at some point, it may also be that they will be useful for, doing impact analysis, doing human rights impact analysis, but not until such time as we've gained far more experience with them, and sort of the way I've been looking at it. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. Basically trying to find a way to keep working on this without transgressing any borders, as it were.
Whoops. Hi. A couple of things. Number one, I think that continuing to focus on using reviews as a way of evaluating 8280 is perfect, right? The other thing is in how you're dealing with the working groups that, whose documents you're evaluating. I think the other day Mallory referred to the DKG model, which I think is a good way to describe it, because of course he's doing work in these working groups. So I think that, if you're interested in having an impact, which is a lesser priority right now, the thing to do is to work with the working group. So rather than producing a document, send email to the mailing list and recognize that this is an iterative process. It's interactive. You're engaging with people. You're not sort of delivering an evaluation and boom, it's done. So I think it's really important to work with folks and work using their methods. So
Definitely agree with that. And I think there's a lot of consensus among folks who have been doing reviews that would actually make it a lot easier for them to say what they want to say.
Alyssa Cooper. I think I understand sort of the motivation for what you described, Avery, but my experience in the IETF is that when people receive a review, they respond to it as if it's like a full-throated, ready-to-go analysis. And this is true, even for the directorate reviews, the real directorate reviews, which are supposed to be for the benefit of the area directors. You get lots of people commenting on them, and sometimes you have these really long threads, which are great. It's fine. They make the documents better, but those aren't even necessitated by the directorate reviews, and they happen anyway. So I think it's a little naive to think that these would be sent and if they were sort of the same tone and tenor as some of the previous ones, that they would be received any better, because there's a disclaimer at the top that says we just did this for our own benefit, but we're sending it to you anyway. So I think if the idea is to sort of further the understanding of 8280 and figure out how it works, then probably better to sort of consume those within the group, or I don't even know what group it is really, because they're not supposed to be coming out of this research group, but maybe that could be sent back to the research group for consumption and further development. I just don't think the model of sending something which is not really mature to somebody, you will still elicit lots of comments, and that might not be what you wanted.
Can I ask you a question? Can you say the mic? So I think that we definitely are starting to use the word review with a little r and not a big R. I don't think that we want to do directorate style reviews. That is definitely not going to work. And it's also what Melinda just said, and something that people who've been doing them recognize would be a lot better, actually, if they just did this that way. But what I think we need to do is figure out and focus on how to bring that knowledge back into this group based on what Avery's saying, but not about the substance of the review, not about the protocols themselves, but about the meta process, about how that's gone and what we've learned about the content in 8280. So that's still TBD, but I think we'll have to continue to keep it as part of our agenda and as something that we're talking about. And I think we'll definitely be very reflective on that before we have the next meeting, so that it's very clear what the point of that agenda point is and how we actually facilitate that knowledge sharing back into the research group.
Sure.
That wasn't a question for you, but I just wanted to see you nod when I said that. So thank you.
Hi, Daniel Kahn-Gilmore I think I follow the DKG model perhaps better than anyone does, just because I get whatever I do apparently happens to be the DKG model. So, what's that? Oh, thank you. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different things that are happening here when people are looking at historical documents that IETF has published, that we have an opportunity to consider both those documents and 8280 in concert and look at the way that those things reflect each other. And I think that's really valuable work to happen here. I'd love to hear more research that describes the how those pieces of the puzzle are connected, similarly to what the scholars who spoke with us earlier today were talking about, like how can we do that analysis? And I think if you're here because you care about human rights, it's very difficult to imagine that you're only going to be looking at historical documents, and you would like to be engaged. And if you find yourself engaged in a working group, the right way to work with that working group is very much in the style of the working group and how they want to do it. And if you find yourself there and you say, oh man, in this working group, people are having these particular discussions about these factors, and these are considerations that are not present in 8280, thank you. Sorry, I've lost my RFC memory here. Then that's a great thing to bring back here and say, hey, there's a gap in our analysis of how human rights protocol considerations are being discovered here and addressed or not addressed here at the IETF. And it would be good for us to think about whether it's a rev to 8280 or something else, to have that process inform future descriptions of how this sort of thing works here. So just wanted to.
Thank you. Just wanted to point out that we're at time. Were you walking to the queue? In which case, you will be the last one to speak on it. But please, go ahead.
Christian Wittemer. I wonder whether we could drive a small experiment to compare several review formats. Because 8218, the big RFC says that you have to publish a human rights review, which tends to encompass lots of different subjects and be quite long. And I wonder whether it could be tried to just do a review on, say, impact on censorship or impact on accessibility in underdeveloped countries or something like that, but basically something focused.
If I can ask, you mean of multiple pieces of RFC, and it's not just of one document, but take across subject across several, that kind of thing, or?
You could do that. What I had in mind is an alternative to the model of arriving in a working group and doing a full-throated human rights review. Of just doing a review on a small subject, because it will be, well, easier to do. And also it might be easier to consume. And maybe I'm completely wrong, but I mean, that's...
It's a good experiment.
Yeah.
Thank you. Should try it. Yes, please.
Goshabit Grover, Center for Internet and Society. I've written a review, and as an IETF participant, my aim is to improve the protocol in certain ways. Sometimes this is possible. Intuitively, I read a draft, I figure out some problems in it, I can comment on it. Another exercise I've done is the read 8280, use the considerations as a framework for analyzing that protocol, and that has been useful as well. It has helped me figure out some problems that I wouldn't be able to otherwise. I guess the point I'm getting to is that the review format is a culmination of that exercise, which is both consumable for the working group and for HRPC to use to improve the guidelines or in that way. So just explaining why that earlier format, if you're losing it, was useful. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, and very much appreciate the work that you've been doing with the reviews, because it's been very interesting work. So thanks, and I wish we had gotten more time to talk about them. Last speaker.
Sorry for keeping everyone. I'm Brooks Schofield, white, Anglo-Celtic male, rapidly approaching 50. Come from an island and a country that doesn't share a border with anyone, so there's lots of issues in this space that I do not understand and probably will never fully comprehend. The Next Generation Internet Initiative, this is what I've been spruiking all this week, and I apologize for banging on about this again, but building the next generation internet may encompass a feminist internet, but our assessment panel lacks diversity because it was in fact compiled by people matching my profile. So I'll probably reach out to this group looking for more diversity on the, assessing these areas, because yeah, we lack. Okay, we may have people that come from Europe and countries that do share a border, but the initial assessment of me is commonplace.
Thank you. I'm sure lots of people here would be happy to be reached out to. Okay, thank you. We went over. Sorry for the things we didn't get to. Sorry for my discombobulation at the beginning where my head was, I don't know where. Okay, yes?
Yeah, I really liked today's format in the sense there was a presentation with possibly with the background of a research paper or theoretical framework, but there was also a draft to read. So this format was great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all. And thank you for bearing with us.
I have blue sheets at the front if you didn't sign them.
yes.
Please do. Thanks.
To the remote folks, bye-bye.
Yes.